Welcome, everybody. I'm Jay Garfield, and I direct the Buddhist Studies program here at Smith. And I'm really happy to welcome you to the second annual Marylin Rhie Memorial Lecture. So we are here to honor the memory of Marylin Rhie, who from 1984 to 2016 taught art history, East Asian studies, Buddhist studies here at Smith as the Jesse Wells Post Professor of Art and East Asian Studies. Marylin Rhie was, as many of you, speaking to many people who remember Marylin as well as I do, but for some who don't remember Marylin as well as I do. Marylin was a formidable scholar of international reputation, an inspiring, demanding, and beloved teacher at Smith College, and an extraordinarily generous and erudite colleague to many of us, whether in art history, in Buddhist studies, in East Asian studies, history, sinology. If you were in a room with Marylin Rhie, whether it was a seminar or a classroom or an informal discussion, you know that Marylin knew more than anybody else in that room about whatever topic was under discussion. She was erudite beyond belief. Her multi-volume history of Chinese and Central Asian art, but when I say multi-volume, we're talking over 2,000 pages of closely argued text, over 1,000 pages of important illustrations. That's going to be the standard reference work in Central Asian and Chinese art history for decades to come. Our students will be consulting that work and will be full of admiration for the person who put that together. Marylin did not tolerate error and ignorance. So one of the things that I always enjoyed about Marylin in conversation was that if you made a mistake, you weren't corrected. Instead, Marylin produced a gem of an impromptu 10 to 15 minute lecture on the topic, complete with references and examples and citations. And in the end, you were astonished, you were grateful you had made the error because you had learned so much from the mistake. And it was clear that part of Marylin's bodhisattva practice was to make other people feel like bodhisattvas for having made those mistakes and providing the occasion for that kind of education for all of us. And this, I have to say, was true whatever the subject was. It's not just that Marylin knew more about art than anybody in the room, not that she knew more about Chinese history than anybody in the room, but she also knew more about philosophy and the history of Buddhism than anybody in the room. And she integrated that erudition with such ease, such grace, and such generosity that it was a constant gift to all of us. In the classroom, Marylin was inspiring and brought students into art history and carried them through into careers in art history. But she was also rigorous and demanding. And she showed students both the tremendous beauty of art, but also the discipline, precision, and care that was needed to read images, to understand them, and to make something out of them as objects of study. And as a result, students learned not only how to love art, the history of art, and Buddhist art, but really how to think through images in a way that I've seen few other scholars transmit that kind of knowledge to students. As a colleague, Marylin was warm and generous. She tolerated our deficiencies, helped us make the most of what we were doing, and really was a linchpin of the Buddhist Studies program here, of art history, and East Asian studies. And what I want to say is that the kind of interdisciplinarity that we value was embodied by Marylin's work. It was just a work that drew ideas together from all kinds of sources. So it's to remember that enormous, enormous contribution that Marylin made not only to Smith College, but to the world of letters and to generations of students that we've inaugurated this series in her memory. It's my great pleasure to introduce my colleague Yan Langong, who's going to introduce tonight's speaker, who's just a really fabulous person to have doing this, as you all know. Yan Lang.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Jay. So my name is Yang Guo, and I am an art historian of East Asia at Smith College. It is really my special honor to introduce Dr. Sonya Rhie Mace today. So we actually never met until this day, but we are connected in many ways. First of all, I want to say Sonya's mother, as many of you know, the late Professor Marylin Rhie, was my predecessor at the art department. I feel very lucky to have inherited her position and her beautiful office. Sonya is Smith alum. She completed her BA at Smith College in South Asian Art and Religion in 1993. And in 1999, she received her Ph.D. in Indian and South Asian art at Harvard University. So the book that grew out of her doctoral work, titled History of Early Stone Sculpture at Mathura, circa 150 BCE to 100 CE, was published by Brill in 2007. So Mathura is in northern India. It is one of the most important sites of artistic centers for Buddhism and some other religions in India. So I constantly consult Sonya's book for my own teaching as well. So Dr. Mace is the George B. Bickford Curator of Indian and Southeast Asian Art at the Cleveland Museum of Art. She has curated numerous influential exhibitions centering around the South Asia and Southeast Asia, Asian art. So in fall 2017, her exhibition Beyond Angkor, Cambodia Sculpture from Ben T. Chimar, featured an unprecedented loan of bas-relief from the temple enclosure wall of year 1200 from the National Museum of Cambodia. And the exhibition was resulted from the signing of a cultural cooperation agreement with the Ministry of Culture and Fine Arts of the Kingdom of Cambodia. And this summer, Dr. Mace will host the major exhibition of Rajput paintings around 1700. So it is titled A Splendid Land, Paintings from Royal Udaipur, and organized by the Smithsonian's National Museum of Asian Art. So many artworks are on loan from India, so this is really a rare opportunity, maybe something to think about, put on your summer travel plan. So she is also teaching at Case Western Reserve University. Her courses cover topics in the art of India and the global medieval monuments and manuscripts. So she continues to lecture and publish regularly on her ongoing research, most recently focusing on depictions of nuns and women's fertility rites in early Buddhist relief sculptures of India. So her talk today, titled Sandalwood and Radiance, Tracing the Transmission of Early Buddha Images, discusses multi-sensorial aspects of the Buddha image as it moved from India to China in the first centuries of the Common Era. So after the talk, there will be a Q&A session. Without further ado, let's welcome Dr. Mace.
Yeah, let's have the lights off. It's a real art history talk. Well, thank you so much, Yanlong. What a wonderful way to meet you. Thank you for the lovely introduction. And Jay, what a fabulous way to remember my mother. It is something that, I guess we do need the lights on for the recording. So we'll put them back up. Higher. Oh, it's overwhelming for me to be back on campus, especially in this regard, where I am standing here in honor of my own mother, who actually started teaching here part-time in 1974. I remember how traumatic it was when she started going to work when I was only 3 years old. And I would often come with her on my days off from school and sit through her lectures on Chinese art, Japanese art, Indian art, go for lunch and have grilled cheese sandwiches at the Davis Center. And I loved it here at Smith so much that I decided to come here for college myself. and got what I feel is just an unparalleled education. So I'm so grateful to this institution, grateful to the Buddhist Studies program and all of my mother's dear colleagues and students over the years who appreciated all that she devoted herself to. And that was really Buddhist art from around the world and the great accomplishments of those who made them. So I struggled a little to decide what I should talk about to honor my mother's work, and also to try to honor her constant encouragement of me to continue conducting research in my own field, which is Indian art. And so in order to try to cover both wishes of hers, I will talk about the early Buddha images. But her career and her writings spanned so many areas. So I just put 3 representative examples on the screen here. Early Buddhist art of China and Central Asia. The art of Tang Dynasty Buddhist monuments, which is actually where she got her start. And this particular image is what she told me first inspired her to take a course in Chinese art history at the University of Chicago while she was still an undergraduate. So it's a Tang Dynasty Buddhist sculpture in the Art Institute of Chicago. And then actually I think internationally she's extremely well recognized for her work in Tibetan art. And since last year, Professor Thurman gave an extraordinary lecture. Oh, my goodness, it's difficult to follow in those footsteps too. He gave us an extraordinary lecture about her contributions to the understanding of Himalayan art. So that was the first annual lecture in honor of Marylin Rhie. So there were many choices to discuss for today's lecture, such as her very early work, so starting out with some of her earliest publications from the mid-1960s, such as the 1965 article that she co-authored with her Ph.D. advisor, Father Harry van der Stappen at the University of Chicago. So they co-authored a massive article on the sculptures of the cave temples at Tianlongshan in China, and they were able to use visual analysis to take all of these sculptures that are scattered in museum collections around the world and to be able to attribute them to the caves to which they belonged, and then also to create a chronology of these sculptures. And it's such close analysis. Basically, she was trained in the direct lineage of the Swiss art historian Heinrich Wülflin, who was able to, who was the first real proponent of using visual analysis for identification of art in the Western canon. And then his student Ludwig Bachhofer, who then translated that methodology to the study of Asian art. And van der Stappen was a student of Bachhofer, my mother, the student of van der Stappen. So this wonderful lineage is evident, especially even in this early article. And their analysis and the dating and chronology that they were able to secure and argue in this article are still used today. So that, for example, these are the groups of some of the pieces that are in the Nelson Atkins Museum in Kansas City, where those are from Cave 4 and those from Cave 17 can be identified as being really within a quarter century of one another. And so much of their dating, it still sticks today. When new evidence comes out, I think every single example that has had some kind of scientific testing or new inscriptions that have been found have actually corroborated my mother's datings of most of the images based solely on her visual analysis of the art. She also then completed her dissertation, which came out in a publication in 1977 on the Tang Dynasty sculptures of the Foguangsi and Wu Taishan, so a very important early Chinese monastery and temple that was actually established, I think, because there was a vision of a miraculous light, like a halo that appeared on Wu Taishan, and it's on that site that this temple was founded in the Northern Wei, 5th century, I think, and then the great the main temple hall is full of all these monumental sculptures that she worked out, that she was able to identify all the chronology, the iconography, and explain the revival of Tang sculpture even after a major persecution in the middle of the 9th century. So that's where she really established that methodology of using historical sources, inscriptions, and then also importantly with this study, the relationship with the Buddhist art that then was transmitted from China to Japan and Korea, and also looking at sources in India. So this really brought her to this international exploration of Buddhist art from across the entire Buddhist world. And so my mother, and together with my father, who's here in the audience, they traveled and lived in places like Kyoto and Benares, traveled all over Korea, China, Japan, India, Pakistan, Afghanistan, Java, Sri Lanka, and even to all the major museum collections of early Buddhist art from China and Central Asia kept in Moscow and St. Petersburg, Czechoslovakia in those days, and all of the collections of Buddhist art in private collections and museum collections throughout the West. And so she amassed, thanks to also my father's photographic skills, she amassed an archive of Buddhist art that she then was able to mine constantly for her work. And I had the privilege of accompanying her on her research trips, starting from, I guess, 1978, when I was 6, and then up until 1992. And here's a photo from the last research trip that I accompanied my mother on. This is my father and I are always somehow walking a few paces ahead of her, but she takes these great photographs. This is up in Gansu province at the site of Wenshushan. And then over in Turfan, and you can just see my mother was never happier than when she was in the field and looking for and finding those Buddha images. So this was 1992 in Turfan, and we were just about to head out to see the cave temples at Bezek Leak. So all of that field work resulted in her opus, which is 3 volumes that were published in 1999, 2002, and 2010 on early Buddhist art of China and Central Asia. And as Jay so kindly said, they are standard reference works. But I have to say, I think so in preparation for today's talk, I started rereading them and reading parts of them that I had never read before. I have to confess, I haven't read them all cover to cover. It takes incredible patience because her mind she had a photographic memory, and she also had a love of language and her ability to convey her enthusiasm and her sharpness of vision in writing. And honestly, I never heard her complain about having to sit down and write. You can sense the joy in her writing, and also sense how urgently she wanted her readers to understand and to see what these artists accomplished, and she could appreciate what they went through in order to create these works that we're so lucky still survive to this day. So for today, I would like to focus on just one tiny sliver, honestly, of her contributions that are in this. And I was just telling Jay, thank goodness the Buddhist Studies Department founded this memorial lecture, because we'll have lecture topics for the next 100 years, based on her work. And he said, only 100? Good point. But since I'm a specialist in the art of India, I thought I should go ahead and talk about something that relates to something I know something about. So I decided to zero in on her discussions of the early Buddha images in China that have close relationships with the early art of India. So what I'm showing here on the screen, you won't believe me if I tell you right now that I'm going to argue by the end of this lecture that all these images depict exactly the same thing. And none of them looks anything alike. So the two images on the right, for example, are two sculptures that survive that have documented identifications as being copies of the so-called Sandalwood Buddha image that King Udayana commissioned when the Buddha was up in heaven preaching to his mother. And King Udayana missed him so much, he commissioned an image of the Buddha made of sandalwood. Now, as you can see, one is standing, one is seated. And actually Dorothy Wong, I think, has been talking quite a bit about these two kinds of images. There's also another literary source discussing another kind of Udayana sandalwood image where he's seated on a lion throne. And then in early India, what do we have but no depiction of the Buddha image of King Udayana at all, but we do have quite a few important representations of what's called the Ganda Kuti, which means the chamber of fragrance. And it's in the chamber of fragrance that King Udayana's sandalwood Buddha image was kept until it, or a copy of it, was brought to China. So these are two different depictions of the so-called Ganda Kuti that also, even though they're from pretty close to the same date, actually look very different from one another. So what I'm going to argue is something that, well, first of all, so the central image is the one my mother really spent a magisterial amount of time describing. And she analyzed so perspicaciously all of its visual elements and their sources. So what I would like to do is really build on her discussion of this image and focus more, though, on other characteristics. So these other characteristics being the ideas of fragrance and radiance that the sculpture implies. So these characteristics of fragrance and radiance are visually circumscribed by materiality, so like the material of sandalwood or gold, or by the environment, so garlands and flowers and incense and lamps that would be brought by devotees, and also by indexical signs, so things like the lotus flower and flames. So what I'm going to try to propose today is that these characteristics of fragrance and radiance were of paramount importance in the establishment of the early Buddha image, be it in the 2nd century BCE in India, or in 6th century China, or even 10th century Japan. And that like if fragrance, especially that of sandalwood, and radiant effulgence or miraculous light are present in, on, or around the image of the Buddha, these features really denote the presence of the Buddha, and that the external appearance of the image was therefore up to the makers to decide and to choose the way that these forms or the image of the Buddha would most resonate with their individual communities. So I'll just take a moment to describe this flame-shouldered Buddha in the collection of the Harvard Art Museums. So we have a view from the front and a view from the rear. So it's a seated image of a male figure, seated in a yogic position with legs crossed, hands resting in the lap in what's called the dhyana mudra, the mudra of meditation. And he's dressed in a heavy robe that's basically derived from the kind of robes worn on sculptures of the seated Buddha in the region of Gandhara, which is present-day Pakistan and also Afghanistan and their related areas. He's seated, he has his face, it has a mustache, it has meditative equipoise, but also a sense of seeing, of presence. He has an ushnisha with a square hole in the top, which is kind of mysterious, but I think most scholars all agree it would have once held a relic. This is actually a reliquary image, if that's the case. On the back, there's a boss that shows there was once a halo, but only around the head, not around the whole body. And the figure sits on an altar, which is this pedestal, which is really an altar with two roaring lions bearing their teeth on either side, and then a pot full of lotus flowers and lotus leaves growing out of the pot. Now, what I think is the most distinctive element of this sculpture are these flames that are emitting from the shoulders of the Buddha. Now, my mother also, she spoke about the flame-shouldered Buddha as being of about the same date as a lot of other Buddha images that were already being made throughout China. And this would be at the end of the Han Dynasty, so from about 150 CE to like 220 CE. And she, in her volume 1, she laid out all of the little tiny and small and kind of inconspicuous images of the Buddha that are found in the context of actually many other kinds of popular sculptures that are associated with Taoism and other popular image cults. So this is Kong Wangshan. They're cliff carvings, and they date to the end of the 2nd century CE. And there are 2 or 3 images that are identified as Buddhas among all the many carvings of other Taoist and popular Chinese figures. So that's on the east coast. So there are Buddha images all the way on the east coast of China, all the way to the western extreme in Sichuan, where there are tombs that included images of the Buddha, such as on the lintel of the Mughal tomb, and which is shown as a close-up here. But again, that's part of this kind of auspicious imagery program to accompany the dead in the afterlife. Also in tombs from Sichuan are quite a number of what are known as money trees, where there are small images of the Buddha together with coins and other images, and often sometimes with images of foreigners, such as the attendant of the Buddha here, who wears the crossed robe that identifies most likely not a Han Chinese donor, but a foreign donor. And there are quite a few historical records of foreign merchants who rose to financial and social prominence enough to be able to have these fairly elaborate tombs. So now we come to the flames of this important sculpture. And it's something, I was just in New York last week and went to the Morgan Library and saw the exhibition on the Mesopotamian goddess Enheduanna, and just saw flaming shoulders quite about everywhere. So it's a motif that's really deeply long established in Mesopotamia. And so, for example, the sun god Shamash here has flames issuing from his shoulders. And this is ancient, right? From around 2250 BCE. The very famous stele with the code of Hammurabi from about, I guess, 500 years later or so in the 1700s BCE. Again, the god of the sun has flames issuing from his shoulders, that kind of effulgence. And then it's picked up again on the coinage of the Kushan kings. It's where it's really prominent. I mean, it's like almost all of them, especially during this period from Vema to Huvishka. So that's like between about 100 to 190. So really the 2nd century, where royal imagery is just given flaming shoulders as a standard. Images of the Buddha with flaming shoulders we can trace to a number of sculptures from Afghanistan in particular. There's this gorgeous piece in the home of the collectors from the south of France, the Skenazy collection, which was found right by Begram. And then the quite well-known, incredible sculpture of the Buddha performing the double miracle of fire and water from the site in Afghanistan, the monastery of Paitava. So the previous sculpture that we just saw of the individual Buddha may be like from a group, so that we see, 2 of those seated Buddha images flanking the main Buddha in the center. So this sculpture, the miracle of that he performs at Shravasti. Honestly, really more accurately, it should be said miracles in plural, because in order to convince heretics that he was an enlightened being of supreme and miraculous powers, he, at the site of the city of Shravasti in central India, he performed a number of miracles. He was able to rise up into the air to the height of the palm trees. He was able to have water issue from under his feet and flames issue from his shoulders. He also was able to multiply himself. So hence there are three, more than one Buddha. And all of these miracles were able to affect quite a number of conversions to Buddhism. A sculpture in the Cleveland Museum of Art that's on the poster for this talk shows the same miracle, but now as made by artists in Gandhara in Pakistan, so near Lahore. And this is slightly different from the Afghan versions, where the water swirls out from under his feet, the flames billow out from his shoulders, and the whole entire stele, the relief, would have been gilded. So it would have shone as gold and reflected the light. So around him we have two monks kneeling in adoration, two gods, Brahma and Indra, who are adoring him, and other gods on the flanking sides that introduce this other multi-sensory component that is the topic probably for another lecture, and that is sound, where the gods, because of the wondrousness of his miracle, the gods whistle, and then they take their robes and shake them. So we know that this is indeed an extraordinary event. And I love this image as well, because in this depiction of the miracle at Shravasti, where it's the miracle of multiplication of the image of the Buddha. These little Buddha images, to me, they stand in for the flames. So it's like this, where instead of flames, we have the body of the Buddha. So it's this idea of substitution, where the body of the Buddha is radiance. Now, heading farther south into India, the heart of early Buddhist art and early Buddhism, this is the site of Sanchi in central India, and a pillar from a gateway from one of the great stupas of early India. And this is what the miracle at Shravasti looks like in India. We don't see any flaming shoulders or any water issuing out from the feet of the Buddha. Instead, what we see is an emphasis on another one of the miracles at Shravasti, which is the miraculous planting of a mango tree. So the Buddha planted a mango seed, and instantly it grew into a mature tree in full flower and full fruit. And so what we have as the miracle at Shravasti is an altar that stands in for the presence of the Buddha. An altar is the locus of sanctity par excellence, no matter what religion you belong to. And the mango tree is behind it. Gods who inherently smell wonderful are bringing garlands of flowers. The umbrella above the mango tree is also hung with garlands. And in the sky, again, this element of sound, where the gods are banging on drums to celebrate the miracle. And other gods at the very top of the relief have baskets of flowers that they're throwing out of their baskets. So you can imagine the fragrance of the flowers drifting down around the mango tree. Now, what's interesting to me also is the relief just below this, which geographically takes place in the same place. So Shravasti is a city, and just on the outskirts of the city, there was a park. It was a park enclosed by a wall, and it was called the Jetavana. It was the park or the garden of Prince Jeta. And this is the Jetavana. And how do we know that? Because all along the ground are these little, like, squarish, roundish shapes, and those are all coins. So the Jetavana, so one of the Buddha's disciples was a wealthy merchant by the name of Anathapindika, and he wanted to donate a plot of land for the Buddha to have a monastery where the Buddha and the monks could have a place during the rainy season retreat. And so he asked Prince Jeta of Shravasti if he could buy the Jetavana. And the prince said, no, he kind of likes it. He's not for sale. And except, it's not for sale unless the entire park is covered with coins. And so Anathapindika agreed and covered the entire ground of all of the Jetavana with coins. Now, so we know it's set in the Jetavana, but what's happening here? And so this is something that I haven't seen any other art historians suggest, that this might be the miracle of multiplication, where we have 3 different altars, each within a little shrine or a kuti, and each one is being worshipped. So it's not like these are just the buildings of the monastery. Each one has its own altar, and it's being worshipped, and that signals the presence of the Buddha. We also know that this is Jetavana because of this little guy here. This is a little guy called Priyankara. He is the youngest son of a yakshi who had been, there are a number of different versions of the story, but this yakshi had been eating other people's children because she had 500 children, and she had to get enough food for all of them, and people were getting upset and asked the Buddha to help. So the Buddha kidnapped this yakshi's youngest and favorite boy, who was Priyankara, and hid him in the Jetavana. Until the yakshi came and finally asked, why did you take my child? And the Buddha explained, you can't be eating other people's kids. And she said, I got it. And so she then converted to Buddhism. So anyway, he's here being hidden in the Jetavana. Now, I think it's interesting also that, we'll take note of this now, that 2 of these kutis are kind of barrel vaulted. And one of them is a hut shape. So that means it's round on plan with a thatched roof hut. So they're not all the same structure. Each one is a little different. And the one on the top has a garland hanging from the center. So we could argue that that's the Ganda Kuti because it has the garland in the center, and that this might be the Kosamba Kuti because we'll see in a second here in this relief of the Jetavana from Bardhut, which is from about 100 years earlier. There's an inscription on the side here identifying this little hut as the Kaushambi Kuti or Kosamba Kuti, which is the name of another hut in the monastery of the Jetavana. Now, this is another great relief. It's here on one of these pillars. It shows the actual act of the laying of the coins along the ground at the Jetavana. There's an ox cart, and workers are taking out the coins and spreading them. Now, this figure here is Anathapindika, who's overseeing the work, and also up there holding the water pot, because pouring water seals the gift. So as soon as all the money is laid out, he then pours the water as the gift to the Buddhist community. We have the gods up here doing their usual whistling, waving their clothes, and then there are 3 places where we can identify the presence of the Buddha. One is the mango tree, the great mango tree. There's an altar underneath it, and also a railing, which also identifies a sacred tree. And here is the Kaushambi Kuti, but there's an altar inside, covered with flowers, hung with a garland. There's another kuti at the top with the inscription at the top identifying it as the Ganda Kuti, so the fragrance chamber, also with the altar and garlands hanging inside. So how do we interpret this? Which one is the real Buddha? Is the Buddha actually there receiving the gift from Anathapindika? Could we say that the Buddha is in all 3 places? Could it be a compression of time where the Buddha is sometimes in the Ganda Kuti, sometimes in the Kaushamba Kuti, and sometimes under the mango tree? I think compression of time is something that Indian artists constantly do and continue to do to this day. I'm going to show you another example of the purchase of the Jetavana. This time, we keep on moving south. So now we're going down to Amaravati. And here is an inscription that identifies these buildings at the bottom of the relief as being at Shrivasti. So this is the city of Shrivasti. And then there's this wonderful fence with a gateway with a tile roof on top. And above that, the ox cart where they're laying out the coins. And above that, it's too abraded, but you can see like a little bit of the remains of a big structure in the middle and another smaller structure on one side. And there's an inscription there, too, that identifies it as the monastery of Anathapindika in the Jetavana. So now I'll get to my new discovery, which I'm excited to share with you today, on the versions of the Jetavana story at a stupa that was uncovered fairly recently, so in the 90s, and it's called the Great Stupa at Kanaganahalli in the present-day state of Karnataka in southwestern India. It's connected by river to the major stupas of Amaravati, Nagarjunakonda, and the whole cluster of stupas in Andhra Pradesh. This is how it looks. It would have been, a large hemispherical dome, but surrounded by a circumambulatory path. Now, among all the copious finds at Kanaganahalli, there are 4 slabs that are from an earlier period than all the rest of the carved reliefs. And we can date those to the late 2nd century BCE, or early 1st century BCE. And you can see this one's still in place, and it shows the gift of the Jetavana. So these were in place along the base of the stupa. Here's the ox cart, the familiar coins being unloaded out of the ox cart, mango tree. And there's a second one also that is a little bit fuller and a little bit more complete. Now, there's a palm tree at the very top, which to me suggests a relationship possibly with the fact that at the miracle of Shrivasti, he rose to the height of the palm trees. And again, down here, just inside the gate, the distribution of the coins along the ground. Now, the one thing that so far none of the publications, at least, has noticed is this little inscription. Sorry, I don't have a pointer, but it's on the second entablature of the large central building. There's the first akshara that says ga, and a little bit of the second akshara, and that would be the left part of the syllable da. And then the little bit, after the big crack, there's the little bit of, that would be the vowel E. That would be at the top of E, or the word T. And so that, I would argue, would have to be Gandakuti. So if that identifies that central multi-storied building as the Gandakuti, which I think it would have to, because also so many sources discuss the Gandakuti as being the structure at the center of the Jetavana that really is the Buddha's hall, the fragrance hall. That is where he slept, he meditated, he spent all his time. It was illuminated with a divine light, and it constantly had the fragrance of sandalwood. So the Gandakuti would be in the center, and the other monastic buildings are all around it. What's also extraordinary about this is that, okay, so Gregory Chopin has done a major study of the descriptions of the Gandakuti in the Mula-Sarvastivada in Vinaya, and has said that really, basically, wherever we see this term Gandakuti being used in India, it's probably a site that's using the Mula-Sarvastivada in Vinaya. So the monastic code of the Mula-Sarvastivadins, because the Gandakuti is practically throughout this Vinaya identified with the presence of the Buddha. So much so that if you build a special hut and you smear it with fragrance, smear it with sandalwood paste, then the Buddha will come there. The presence of the Buddha will come. So not only does the Buddha have fragrance, but if you create a space with fragrance, the Dharma will be there. The Buddha's presence will come there. And so so this is the only place that the term Gandakuti appears in the South. So this would identify the Buddha as being there. But there's this other inscription down here that says the Buddhas, Bhagavato. So he's called the Blessed One or the Lord, the Bhagavan. And this one, though, is the Buddha's house, place, body. And just in case you weren't sure that that's what they really meant, the artists put 2 worshipers only there, right next to this little building. So that's the Gandakuti, but the Buddha is here. So what do we make of that? Let's go on a little walk around the Jetavana. So first, you enter in through the gateway with this tiled roof here. And the first little open pavilion that you see, do you remember the little kid, Priyankara, that we saw in Sanchi? Well, his mom came and found him. So this is Priyankara with his mother, the Yakshi, identified by inscription above. The gift is happening here. The mango tree is here. Here's the Buddha in his place, being under worship, maybe receiving the coins, maybe overseeing what's going on, maybe walking around. Above, there's this little stupa that may or may not belong to this relief. It's a separate piece that isn't in all the photographs. So someone just laid it there, so we'll bracket that for now. So we'll move clockwise around the relief. Above that is an inscription that identifies that little structure as the Venerable Ananda's, so Ananda's place. Above that, in the upper left corner, are a pair of Buddha's footprints, the pada. So these, and I'll show a close-up in a second. Next to that is a little structure that's identified as the well, and inside, so that's the well water, the fresh water for the monastery would be drawn from there. The next little building is the Kosambakuti, so the little hut of the Kaushambi hut of the monastery where the Buddha sometimes was. Next to that is a little walking path called the Chankrama, which was the Buddha's meditation walkway. And it has the Buddha's footprints walking down it. Underneath the Chankrama is the Bodhi tree, but the Bodhi tree of Ananda. So Ananda said to the Buddha, how can we as followers find you when you're gone? And he said, you can plant, get a cutting from the Bodhi tree where I reached enlightenment. You can plant it there. And so Ananda did, and it grew into a tree, and the Buddha blessed it by sitting, reenacting the defeat of Mara and the night he reached enlightenment. And so it's surrounded by a railing. And underneath that is Rahula's place, the son of the Buddha. Now, the Gandakuti is the fragrance chamber, so really the largest building on that relief. And I'm just reminded also of when the Buddha was coming from the Tushita heaven to be born and incarnate himself as in his last birth, and his mother, the womb of Maya, the queen. And the gods said to him, he said, you've been spending all these eons in the Tushita heaven where everything smells great. What are you going to do? How are you going to stand being inside the body of a human woman and how stinky it is? So what they did was they got a sandalwood chamber, embedded it in another sandalwood chamber, and then put another little chamber smeared with perfume, and then the Buddha, shown here as a little elephant, would be impregnated into Maya. So he was triple shielded from the stench of a human. So what I think the way I'm going to interpret this relief is that, yes, the Gandakuti is the Buddha's place. It's the main place where you recognize the presence of the Buddha, especially at the Jetavana. But that's not the only place you can find the Buddha. You can find him in many different places and feel his presence, recognize his presence in all kinds of different forms, each of which look nothing like the other. So there's a barrel-vaulted shrine that we know for sure the Buddha's here. And then the pada, right? The Buddha's footprints. Here's a detail. So it's a slab. It's definitely not just his footprints, like he's just standing there. It's actually a depiction of one of these slabs, of which there are quite a few. So here's an example here. It even has the relief of the lotus rhizome going around the border. And these padas, speaking of fragrance and radiance, there are these, the wheels of the Dharma in the middle of the footprints, which are also solar symbols and symbols of light. And then all around the borders are the lotuses, which have the fragrance component. And you can also see here in the close-up the house with the well, and just see the little curvature of the round well of water. And also here's the close-up of the chankrama, which with the little footprints of the Buddha as he's walking on that path. And we know also that's another way where the Buddha's presence can be worshipped. There's one at Sanchi, for instance, where the chankrama there is covered and bedecked with garlands. And also, images at Sanchi showing the Buddha as a under worship at Sarnath, where he gave his first teaching, with the wheel and the pillar. And even, speaking of radiance, a fiery pillar itself seated here. This is another depiction of his first teaching at Sarnath, where his presence is equally recognizable just as a fiery pillar. And this is the closest thing we have to a flaming image of the Buddha in India. Otherwise, all these flame-shouldered Buddhas are from Gandhara and north and east. So what happened after the miracle of Shrivasti? Well, the rains came, and then the Buddha decided he would go to the heaven of the 33 gods in order to teach the Dharma to his mother, who had died very shortly after she gave birth. But he didn't want anyone knowing he was going to heaven because he thought he might get criticism for that he was going just to enjoy himself. So he did a samadhi where no one would know where he was. So all of his followers, even all his closest monastic followers, didn't know where he was. And there was a lot of anxiety about this. And that's when King Udayana, or some texts say King Prasenajit, commissioned an image of the Buddha to stand in for his presence while he's gone. And so what we see here is the Buddha preaching. It's fragmentary, but it's from Amaravati, but there's a little image of the Buddha on an altar. Here are his footprints. And this is up in the heaven of the 33 gods, where he's preaching to his mother. And then he's about to descend the miraculous staircase to Sankashya. Now, this is the closest thing we even have in Indian art, in India proper, to any possible relationship with the image made while he's gone during this season in heaven. But there are many, many early depictions of his descent at Sankashya. So from Bardhut, from Kanganhali, and from Sanchi. These are three examples that really they promote the pageantry of his descent from heaven, the miraculousness of the staircase, the fact that this is the only time where human beings can see gods, and humans and gods are on the same level together. And there's a huge issue about the smell. The Buddha worries a lot. He says, if the gods smell the people who have come here to greet me, they're all going to expire. So he had to miraculously transform the scent of the people who are gathered to receive him into the smell of Goshirsha sandalwood, which is the most precious form of sandalwood, so that the gods would be able to stand the smell of the humans. And so he's descended. There are three different ways of depicting his descent. It's also very popular in the art of Gandhara. Here is an extraordinary scene where we see the Buddha flanked by Indra and Brahma as he's moving down the triple staircase. And what's also going on here is that there is a Chakravartin, who's a world emperor, an imperial royal figure coming, complete with his wife and full entourage, coming to see the Buddha. But it turns out this is not a real king. And there's a monk in the assembly who smells the king and says, that's not a real king. That is the nun Utpalavarna, because I can smell the scent of the blue lotus, the Utpala. And this is Utpalavarna, who's used her magical powers to transform herself into the Buddha so she can be the first one to welcome him back to earth. And she then, as soon as she gets to the base of the steps, transforms herself back into a nun, it's broken here, who then kneels at the base of the staircase to be the first one to welcome the Buddha back to earth. And then the Buddha rebukes her and says, "Get out of my sight. I don't want to see you again. It is improper for a nun to perform magic in front of her teacher. And in fact, really, monks shouldn't perform magic in front of an audience. Only the Buddha gets to do that." Anyway, this is a great, very early piece from Kaushambi, which shows the nun Utpalavarna labeled in a Brahmi inscription, who's there touching her forehead to the altar, that is the Buddha, with the base of the altar elongated, showing him stepping down from the bottom step of the staircase and elongated down to earth, where she shows her true form. But her true form was really recognized by her fragrance. Now, in Gandhara, we do have a couple of rare examples of the King Udayana's sandalwood Buddha image. And here's an example from Sahri Balol, where King Udayana is actually presenting the image to the Buddha. Now, right after the Buddha sends Utpalavarna away, Udayana comes forward, and of course there are many different textual sources, each with their own account. But to summarize, Udayana brings the image to the Buddha and says, "Look what I made while you were gone. Do you like it?" And the Buddha said, "Yeah, it's great." And the image then, in some texts, it performs a miracle. It'll get up and bow before the Buddha. And sometimes then he takes it to the Gandakuti, and then it comes out of the Gandakuti to meet the Buddha. And then the Buddha said, "No, you're good. Stay in the Gandakuti." And he moves into another building just 20 paces away from the center. Maybe that's the Kanganhali Relief Building, we'll see. But anyway, this image of the seated Buddha image is the sandalwood Buddha image of King Udayana, that the Buddha is saying, "No, it's good, make a Buddha, make an image. This image is going to help me, after I'm gone to parinirvana. It's going to help fulfill my work. And if you make an image, you won't have any effects of any of your bad karma, and you'll certainly go to heaven." And so I just bring this back because here is a seated Buddha with crossed legs in meditative posture with hands in meditation, which looks a lot more like this Harvard Buddha, flame-shouldered Buddha, than the other two sandalwood Buddha images that are either standing or seated with pendant legs. And my mom actually said, wouldn't it be something, if this were actually the earliest known Udayana sandalwood Buddha. She didn't know this work, but I think this would support her argument to show the Gandharan version of the Udayana image. And also, she cited the Book of Zambasta in, I think, volume 2 of her opus, which is a Khotanese poem, where the sandalwood Buddha image is described as seated on a lion throne. So I think it's something that really should continue to be recognized. And these other two documented examples of the Udayana Buddha have come about in different ways, from different sources. Also probably with roots in India stylistically, that my mother has also analyzed in full. So if that means that if it doesn't really matter what the Udayana Buddha image actually looked like, that means then that the way it did look in different times and in different places, it probably had something to do with the people who made it, that they want it to look a certain way or expect it to look a certain way. And on the base of the flame-shouldered Buddha here, and the flames, referencing Sravasti and the site of the place where the image is kept, there's also two donor figures, and so one of which is dressed as a foreigner. So On this side, there's a foreigner wearing the crossed tunic, carrying flowers, which are, of course, fragrant. And on the other side, there's a monk carrying a lamp. So it seems like the patronage for this reliquary Buddha, which isn't very big, it's pretty small. So it would have been kind of a personal reliquary image, which, even though it's made of gilt bronze, it itself isn't made of sandalwood, but it may be a copy, like a small version, a reliquary version of what's described as being the sandalwood Buddha image, in some texts saying that it's 20 feet high. And so this is a very common practice to make smaller scale, movable metal versions of a larger scale in situ sculpture. So we have both lay and monastic donors bringing both emblems of fragrance and radiance. So what else can we know about the people who made the flame-shouldered Buddha? We hardly know anything, really. I mean, we don't know where it came from. There's no inscription or nothing specifically identifying where this Buddha was made or came from. But what my mother did was use extraordinary skill to piece apart the sources of the visual elements of the sculpture. So, for example, the drapery folds are so unique on the flame-shouldered Buddha because they're raised folds, but in the middle of the top of each fold is a little trough. And she doesn't see that anywhere in Gandharan art, in art of Afghanistan or China or India, but it's in Parthian sculpture. So in Parthian sculpture, they have this trough in the middle of the raised ribs. And then there's the face, which she sees very close relationships with the terracotta sculptures of the royal establishment at Kalchayan, which is in western Uzbekistan. Even that same kind of fluffy, pointed mustache and the raised lids of the eyes. She goes through every single element. So even these diamond-shaped ends of her hems that we see as far south as Amaravati, she's noted, and also up through Pakistan and Afghanistan. Here, some examples on the Cleveland sculpture. The lion throne we find on royal images of the Kushans, the Kushan kings such as Vema, and also as individual sculptures of this type that are frontal with kind of stringy hair. And she also identifies a lot of Chinese elements. So, I mean, some scholars actually have said, well, this sculpture looks so foreign, maybe it was just brought to China from Gandhara or Afghanistan or someplace like that. And she said, well, actually, there are elements about this sculpture that are distinctively Chinese. And she says, starting with the drapery, there's a certain lightness about the quality of the fabric where there's a lightness in the way it falls over the body. And then, I love this part, there's this yin and yang in the scoop of the neckline as it's reflected in the scoop of the hem over the altar, where the wider side is on the left at the top, but on his right on the bottom. And this gives a balance in the flow of the drapery that you don't see anywhere else. Indians don't care about balance, and you don't see it in Parthian or Central Asian or Gandharan or Afghan art. It's such a Chinese thing to do or care about. And also, she says, the rounded masses of the body underneath the garment. So this rounded mass. And then also the proportions of the head to the body, where the head is slightly large, in contrast to other Buddha images, and the way that the hair is combed finely away from the face. This is something we see as early as the terracotta warriors of Qinshi Huangdi, and also in contemporaneous, what she would call contemporaneous late Han tomb sculpture as well. And so what kind of a place would commission, what kind of people, where, and what circumstances would commission a sculpture like this with so many sources from Parthian Iran, from Afghanistan, from Khotan, from China, from India? So she says, where else but Luoyang, which is the capital of the later Han Dynasty, where, starting in 148, a number of foreign monks and lay people gathered to begin the translation of Buddhist texts. And there were many different Buddhist texts, both Mahayana and associated with what we call mainstream Buddhism, Sarvastivadin texts, and also quite a number of texts on meditation. There was, so Lokakshema was there, and then in Parthian, and Yuezhi translators, Anshigal, I think, also Anxuan. This was a foreign convening of Buddhist luminaries who were both monastic and lay. There were also, as part of their teams, there were Indian monks and Chinese scholars, all working together to start the process of translating Buddhist texts into Chinese. And this happened predominantly between, I think it was 148 and up to 190, when there was a huge fire in Luoyang, and then after that, everything went kind of downhill. There were some more translations that were done a little bit in the early 3rd century, but that's why she's saying really right around 160 is perfect for a sculpture like this. It is when all of these different strands come together in one place, and in a place, now Buddhism is there in India, in China, all the way from east to west. But in Luoyang, you have a convening of sophisticated Buddhist monks and scholars who would need a meditation image like this, that is a reliquary, and that would be able to appreciate this iconic sculpture for actual Buddhist practice instead of an image of another auspicious, almost deity type of Buddha, which is what we see in the tombs and at Kongwangshan. So that is her argument, which I think is extremely cogent. And also, to bring it back then, finally, this is my last slide, to these three, where we have the Gandakuti in India at Bardhut, where the presence of the Buddha is well established to be recognized in this chamber of fragrance with the scent of sandalwood, which is so important. Actually, there's a rule where if a layperson gives a monk a gift of sandalwood or perfume, the monk is not allowed to put it on his cell walls, because one monk did this, and a bunch of lay people came and started worshiping the monk's cell, thinking the Buddha was there. So the fragrance is really, it's supposed to be reserved for the place of the Buddha and where the Dharma is. And that also in conjunction with radiance and light, which we see, of course, emphasized on the flame-shouldered Buddha, to show not only with the materiality of the gilding, but the presence of the flames, which also, of course, refer to effulgence of the sun and with royal connotations, which is another topic. And then finally, this beautiful painting made by my own radiant mother, where she was always painting in between writing. And we see, even in her own vision of the Buddha, the gently wafting petals of the lotus flowers, scenting the air, and the glow and radiance that comes out from the image of the Buddha. So I'll end there today. Thank you so much for sitting through this long discourse, being here.
Thank you so much. That's just so enlightening for me. Also, I think next time I teach early Buddhist art, I know there are some more images I am to include ideas also. And I'm talking about the wonderful multi-volume book series published by Professor Rhie. It's constantly sitting on my desk, actually. So I think it's pitiful that we haven't translated it into Chinese. I think we really should think about, organizing a project, a translation project. But Q&A, questions or comments? John.
Hey, John. Yeah. Yes, of course. It's from Bactria, right, which was a province of the Hellenistic kingdoms. So there's Greek on one side and Kharoshthi on the other. Yeah. Very multi-ethnic and international, those regions. Hi. So you mean around his neck here? The flames? So those are tongues of flame coming out of his shoulders. Yes, yes. And so his ushnisha at the top of his head has a cavity in it to hold a relic. So it can be any kind of relic. Very possibly, it could be bits of the cremated remains of the body of the Buddha himself, which are said. They're wonderful discussions. Phyllis Granoff has found some great references about the descriptions of the Buddha's funeral pyre and the scent that it gives off, the scent of sandalwood and the smell of his ashes. And so if this were an early example of the sandalwood Buddha, if it had some of that relic of the Buddha within it as well, that would be part of the connection to sandalwood. And so it would both have that scent of sandalwood within it and stand for the actual image of the Buddha made of sandalwood itself, which would have been such a miraculous scent in this early period in China. I read an article on scents and fragrances in pre-Buddhist China, and it's mostly ginseng, Sichuan peppercorn, and they didn't have hardwood aromatics. And so it was with this opening of trade during the 2nd century that aromatic woods such as sandalwood, and then which was the most popular, the most revered, and then there's aloe wood, I think, and camphor. And so the thing that was amazing about them is that they didn't lose their scent. They would have the scent is long last. So if you carve an image out of the hard core of the sandalwood trunk, it doesn't lose the fragrance. So it really seems miraculous. And so this element of being a miraculous image, that's what's necessary, especially when you're forming new communities in a completely foreign location. Right?
A lot of those woods, aromatic woods, they were imported from South Asia, right?
Yes, exactly, imported from South Asia and Southeast Asia. Right. But it's really at the end of the Han when these routes opened up that they first arrived.
Correlated with the transmission of Buddhism?
I do. I think so. Especially since all those early Buddhas, they seem to be related to tombs and sites where foreign merchants lived or came through anyway. And that's, we can't push it earlier than these early 2nd century CE. So it does seem like they appear where foreign communities appear, not only textually, but also there are images in those tombs, and I think also near Kongwangshan. And wherever you see those little early Buddhas, you also nearby find depictions of either those people with the crossed tunics or pointed caps that are these foreigners from Central Asia, or India, as far as India even, Hey, Yael. Thanks for coming.
Thanks for a really exciting talk. So I understand that the representations of early architecture, as we see in Barfoot and also at Sanchi, right? This is what, except for very, very few examples of wooden struts that we see in Chaitias and things like that, this is all we have that survives to give us a sense of what architecture that was largely made of wood.
Right.
Looked like. So I had kind of 2 questions. One, in the representation that we see here on the left of the Gandhakuti, if you could clarify if the Gandhakuti contains sandalwood or if actually the inner struts and other kinds of maybe supportive wooden architecture, that too is sandalwood. So that's one question. And then 2, I was wondering, because there's also this idea of a sort of preservation or commemoration, or sort of memory embedded in other materials, right? Sandstone that is preserving sort of wood, or in the case of the gilt bronze, that is sort of encapsulating or preserving what is also a representation of a sandalwood object. And I was wondering if you could kind of talk us through how you might imagine a devotee at that time if there's a kind of smellscape or smell memory that is meant to be triggered, and what that might look or smell like.
Well, thanks for these thoughtful questions. So for your first question, I'm not sure what kind of wood was used to make the architecture, but I'm pretty sure it would not have been sandalwood. I think that was probably too precious. But there are bits of original wood that do exist at Carle, for instance. So I'm sure that could be tested. Wood testing has become very sophisticated. I know I did read an article about manuscript book covers and wondering if those were made of sandalwood, but they're made of pine. So they use local woods for that construction. But what there are texts that sometimes there's a really special case where you can make a chamber or a structure out of sandalwood, but then the Buddha transforms it into crystal. So he up-levels it even more. But for a Ganda Kuti, really it's supposed to be the smearing of the sandalwood paste. So the unguent that is created from the sandalwood, smear it all over the walls. But you're not limited to just sandalwood. I mean, sandalwood is the good smell par excellence, but you can bring any aromatic, any fragrance. That's why all those flowers and incense, and so it's just all those good smells. So I think, and when you smell those good smells, that's supposed to attract the laity to come to that sacred place. And so it is this very funny, double logic, where if it's sacred, it smells good, or even if it's ethical and moral and good, it smells good. But if you bring good smells, ethical and moral and divine things will appear, will come, it'll attract them, it'll be there. So if you want the divine presence or you want the Buddha, make a fragrant place and the Buddha will come. So it works both ways. So in terms of smellscapes, that's why, if you pass by a good smelling sandalwood, it's a place of sanctity. And that's why you have to be really careful not to put it in the wrong place. Yeah, and there's another story about a sandalwood begging bowl, which you shouldn't, monks, there's another rule, monks should not beg with bowls made of sandalwood. It's too nice, because it's supposed to be only for the Buddha, or where it should be something worshipful. And someone put this sandalwood bowl at the top of a pillar, and a monk, they said, okay, whoever can get the bowl wins. And so one monk, I forget which one it was, maybe Shariputra or something, he used his abilities to fly, which you get when you reach a certain level of attainment, to fly up and grab the sandalwood bowl and bring it down. He's like, yay, me. And then the Buddha said, you shouldn't do that. So just like good Palavarna gets in trouble. So these rules about really high-level monks who should know better, getting in trouble over things to do with smell, it's a kind of recurring motif. And so you really have to be careful where you keep your good sense, because people will make a mistake, and you don't want people worshiping the wrong thing. So smells, I think the smellscapes were important. And then let's see, the second question was about memory in different materials, how different materials can reference a kind of original important material form, like in sandstone. And I think the most interesting one is the use of stone itself to stand in for brick, I think in a Hindu context even, where it took Indians a long time to use stone. We don't have any Buddhist art. So the Buddha lived, in the 5th century BCE, and Bardhut, is 300 years later. And before that, all there is Ashokan pillars. And what took so long? And I think it's like stone is associated with, it's a dead substance. It's not clay or terracotta, which is alive from the earth. It's not purified by fire. It's not made of wood even, which is alive also. It grows from a tree. So you have to kind of ritually transfer stone into another substance that's a living substance for the sake of expediency, because it lasts a long time. So I think that's a really important example. But I think basically the idea of votive images that are that are miniature replicas, like almost like the miracle of replication, right? In multiplication, you have like the Bodhi, the temple at Bodh Gaya. There's so many small-scale models of the Bodhi tree that then people take with them to, they've come on pilgrimage and they bring it back. And it's the same thing, I think, with a lot of bronzes, where you have bronzes that are in the same form as a very special image that stays put. And then the bronze is the movable image that goes elsewhere, but it mentally references the original image that is in wood or another material. So I think that's a constant phenomenon. And even from sculpture to paintings, as well. So.
You showed a carved rock face, which it had little images of Buddha. Is that part of a bigger complex, or did you show us everything in that slide?
The slide that's just the photograph is just a little bit of it. But there's that line drawing that showed, I think, everything. It's a really extensive carving. It's kind of piecemeal. You probably know much more about it than I do, Yanlong. Kong Wang Shan, right? It's almost like a little compendium of numerous different deities that were popular at the time.
Do we have any sense of who would have commissioned such a thing, or why it was made there?
I don't know. Do you?
We have basically only the material evidence, so no textual evidence from that. Wu Hong wrote about it, but mainly about the Buddha image. But about the nature of the Kongwang cliff carving, it's still debatable why and who sponsored it. Yeah, because it's basically one of the earliest stone carving, on a sort of massive scale in China.
So interesting. Yeah. One more question. Two more questions. Yeah. I think we have another 5 minutes, right?
Okay.
Hi.
Just to carry forward the formal analysis a little bit, you talk about how proportionally the head is quite large compared to the size of the body, but then it's actually like kind of all the peripheral elements, right? The frames are not as large as in some other images, as well as the lotus, as well as the lion base, the shrine and stuff. So which leads me to think about the function or the use of this object. You talked about how this is for personal worship, but can you specifically kind of imagine around 160, like in late Han, how this would have been placed in a worship kind of setting? And I'm thinking maybe kind of in comparison with the larger sculptural pieces or architectural pieces, which might be viewed from below. Like, might this be more experienced at the eye level? Just kind of imagine that.
You're asking me to imagine, which is a lot of fun. But I don't know how, based in reality it would be. I can only speak to kind of the Indian side of things, which might be relevant here since there were so many Indians coming to Loyang. So just following my mother's lead, if there is this group of intellectuals, monks and lay people doing translation, all the translation activities I've seen in Buddhist monasteries involve propitiation to the Buddha before you start the work. And also asking forgiveness for any mistakes that you might make. And so I would envision it seated on an altar together with all the, with all the incense and the candles and the lamps and the flowers to ask for to really, as part of devotions, to ensure the correct translation work proceeds. Would you agree, Jay?
Absolutely. In fact, I wouldn't even think of it as necessarily on an altar. I would think of it maybe as literally on the desk on which the translation work is going.
Yeah.
I'm just thinking, when you look at people who are translating now,
Right.
You usually have people sitting around and there's an image on the desk.
Yes. Yes.
Jay, could you repeat what you said for the audience here? I
Oh,
couldn't
I'm
hear
sorry.
what you said.
I was saying that that's probably right, but I would go even further and say maybe not even on an altar, an image this size, It might have been sitting on the table or the desk where the translation work was going on. And you just, when you see people working in teams translating today, there's usually an image, a Manjushri image or a Buddha image,
Right.
sitting on the table near the work.
But I don't know. I would still go for the altar, vote for altar because of the relic
Yeah.
in the
Oh, that's a
head.
good
It's
point.
so sacred
That's true.
in that case that I would think that it would have to be in some kind of a special.
Thinking of the relic, yeah, I keep forgetting the relic.
Mm. Yes.
Well, I was wondering about the whole issue of travel.
Yes.
Both during this time and the geographical areas that we're talking about were huge travel and trade areas. And so one of the reasons for miniaturizing is to be able to take something
Exactly.
with you.
And to make it out of metal.
Yes,
Mhm.
it's lighter, less likely to get harmed by the weather, et cetera.
Right.
So I was wondering when I was looking at this image, whether it was meant as something to be taken on traveling.
I believe
that
so.
You had your at-home worship spots, but sometimes you had to create little spots along the way when you travel by having an image.
So if I were to just spin the yarn, I would say that there was a large Udayana sandalwood image. In fact, there are references, my mother lays them all out, of a 20-foot tall sandalwood Buddha image in a place, I forget the name of it, it's halfway between Khotan and Niya. And there was a sandalwood Buddha there. And what if this was supposed to be the movable image with maybe a piece of it in the relic chamber used by the translators in Loyang? So
Would we think that maybe then there would be others, maybe not made of metal,
I think
that
there
perished, or some others?
I think there are probably a lot of them. It's lucky one survived. I mean, it's amazing. I mean, there were so many persecutions and fires and metals constantly being melted down.
And stone ones that are, the faces are not.
Right, right. So what my mother suggests is that with the fires in 190, that someone took it to the mountains for safety. And that since there was so much upheaval, the monks who cared about it buried it or preserved it somewhere carefully where it managed to survive. Yeah. This is what happens with a number of really important bronzes that managed to survive. So we're so lucky to have this precious sculpture. Yes, one more question? Oh, my pleasure. I'm so happy to be here.
In the past, I've seen photos of the Buddha having like snakes around his neck, like garlands. So I was just wondering, like, what that symbolizes.
Well, here it's not a garland. It's the collar of his robe. So he's not wearing a garland or a snake this time. It's just like the hem of his robe that's folded over and draping over his chest.
And also,
So.
Is it true that the Buddha in ancient India actually time traveled and went to different space and time at different times?
That's
and
the.
also traveled with the speed of light? Almost impossible.
That is the amazing thing about enlightened beings. They can do miraculous things. So I
Okay,
think, yes, thank
so much.
you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Fabulous. Such a
Thank
testament
you,
to your mom.
Jay.